The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the boy, no older than 16, standing in the center of the room. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You're the killer," he said, his words sharp and deliberate, aimed directly at the judge. The room froze. Even the bailiff, who had seen it all, seemed to pause mid-step. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to hinge on what would happen next. How had it come to this? A boy, barely old enough to drive, standing in a courtroom, accusing the judge of murder. It wasn't just the accusation that stunned everyone. It was the way he said it. There was no anger, no hysteria, just a cold, unshakable certainty that sent a chill through the room. This wasn't just any case. This wasn't just any boy. His name was Jamal, and he had been in and out of courtrooms for years, always on the wrong side of the law, always fighting a system that seemed stacked against him. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the truth, and he was willing to risk everything to expose it. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for being unshakable, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, young man," he said, his voice low in warning. But Jamal didn't back down. He couldn't. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he knew. The story of how Jamal ended up in that courtroom is one of twists and turns, of secrets buried deep in truths that no one wanted to face. It's a story about power, about justice, and about the lengths people will go to protect their own. But it's also a story about courage, about a boy who refused to stay silent, even when the whole world seemed to be against him. As the tension in the room grew, Jamal's words hung in the air, unanswered. The judge's face was unreadable, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the bench. The prosecutor exchanged a glance with the defense attorney, both unsure of what to do next. And Jamal? He stood tall, his eyes locked on the judge, waiting. The room was on edge, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the next move. But what happened next would change everything. And no one, not Jamal, not the judge, not anyone in that courtroom, could have predicted how far this would go. The story of Jamal and the judge is one that will stay with you long after the final gavel falls. It's a story that asks hard questions about justice, about truth, and about who gets to decide what's right. But most of all, it's a story about a boy who dared to speak up, even when the odds were against him. And as the tension in the courtroom reached its peak, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. What would happen next? Would the judge respond? Would Jamal's accusation be proven true? Or would the system close ranks, silencing him once and for all? The answers were coming, but not yet. For now, the room remained frozen, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air, unanswered. And in that moment, anything seemed possible. The judge, a man known for his unyielding demeanor and sharp tongue, leaned back in his high-backed chair, his eyes never leaving Jamal. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as if the room itself was waiting for someone to break it. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice calm but laced with an edge that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. "Young man," he began, his tone measured, "you're treading on very thin ice. I suggest you choose your next words carefully." But Jamal didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met the judge's. And in that moment, it was clear that this wasn't just a reckless outburst. This was something deeper, something calculated, something real. To understand how Jamal found himself in this position, you have to go back, way back. Jamal grew up in a neighborhood where the streets were both playground and battlefield. His mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, and his father had been gone since he was a toddler, swallowed up by the same system that now loomed over Jamal. Life wasn't easy, but Jamal had always been a fighter. He had to be. By the time he was 12, he'd already seen more than most people do in a lifetime. Friends lost to violence, families torn apart by drugs, and a system that seemed designed to keep people like him down. But Jamal wasn't just angry. He was smart, observant. He noticed things others didn't, and he remembered them. And that's what got him into trouble. It started with a simple observation. One night, while walking home from a friend's house, Jamal saw something he wasn't supposed to see. A car, sleek and black, pulled up to an abandoned warehouse. Out stepped a man in a suit, his face partially hidden by the shadows. Jamal recognized him immediately. It was the judge. The same judge who now sat before him, his expression unreadable. At the time, Jamal didn't think much of it. Judges were people too, right? They had lives outside the courtroom. But something about the scene felt off. The judge wasn't alone. Two other men joined him, their faces obscured, their voices low and urgent. Jamal couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The way they moved, the way they glanced over their shoulders, it was enough to set off alarms. In his head, he stayed hidden, watching as they disappeared into the warehouse. He didn't know what they were doing in there, but he knew one thing. It wasn't good. Days turned into weeks, and Jamal tried to put the incident out of his mind. But then, something happened that changed everything. A body was found near the warehouse, a young man, barely older than Jamal, shot execution style. The news spread quickly, and the neighborhood was on edge. The police launched an investigation, but it didn't take long for the case to go cold. No witnesses, no leads, just another unsolved murder in a city that had seen too many. But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the judge was connected. He didn't have proof, just a gut feeling and a memory of that night. Still, he knew better than to say anything. Who would believe him? He was just a kid from the wrong side of town, and the judge was a pillar of the community. It was his word, against a man who held the power to lock him up and throw away the key. But Jamal couldn't let it go. He started digging, asking questions, piecing together fragments of information. He learned that the judge had a reputation for being tough on crime, but there were whispers, quiet, cautious whispers, about his connections. People talked about deals made behind closed doors, about favors exchanged in the shadows. Jamal didn't know what to believe, but he knew one thing. The judge wasn't who he seemed to be. And then, there was the boy who was killed. His name was Marcus, and he had been a friend of a friend. Jamal didn't know him well, but he knew enough to know that Marcus wasn't involved in anything that would get him killed. At least, not on his own. The more Jamal thought about it, the more convinced he became that Marcus's death was connected to what he had seen that night. But how? And why? The answers didn't come easy. Jamal spent months gathering information, risking his safety to uncover the truth. He talked to people who didn't want to talk, went places he shouldn't have gone, and saw things he wished he could forget. But with every piece of the puzzle he uncovered, the picture became clearer and more dangerous. He learned about a network of corruption that reached far beyond the judge, involving powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And Jamal, with his relentless curiosity and refusal to back down, had become a threat. It wasn't long before he found himself in the crosshairs. Threats came in the form of anonymous calls and menacing looks. His mother begged him to stop, to let it go, but Jamal couldn't. He was in too deep. And then, one night, the unthinkable happened. His house was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Back off, or else. But Jamal didn't back off. Instead, he took his findings to the one place he thought he might be heard, the courtroom. He didn't have a plan. Not really. He just knew that he had to do something. And so, when his case came up, a minor charge that would have been a slap on the wrist for anyone else, Jamal saw his chance. He stood there, in front of the judge, and dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "You're the killer," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the man who held his fate in his hands. The room froze, and for a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped turning. But Jamal wasn't done. He had more to say, more to reveal. And as the tension in the room reached a boiling point, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The judge's face remained unreadable, but his eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed a flicker of something. Fear? Anger? Jamal couldn't tell. But he knew one thing. He had struck a nerve. And now, there was no turning back. The question was, what would the judge do next? And more importantly, What would Jamal do if the system he was up against decided to fight back? The answers were coming, but not yet. For now, the room remained frozen, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air, unanswered. And in that moment, anything seemed possible. The judge's voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "Bailiff," he said, his tone icy, "remove this young man from my courtroom. We'll reconvene after a brief recess." The words were calm, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. Jamal didn't resist as the bailiff approached, his hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. He knew better than to fight back. Not here, not now. But as he was led out of the room, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking with the judge's one last time. There was something in that look, a challenge, a promise. This wasn't over. Not even close. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was buzzing with whispers. Reporters, lawyers, and bystanders alike were trying to make sense of what had just happened. A boy accusing a judge of murder? It was the kind of story that didn't come around often, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Jamal could feel their eyes on him as he was escorted to a holding room, but he kept his head down, his mind racing. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to blow up like this. Now, the whole world was watching, and that made things even more dangerous. The people he was up against didn't like attention, and they would do whatever it took to make this go away. Jamal knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could end up like Marcus, or worse. Meanwhile, the judge retreated to his chambers, his face a mask of calm as he closed the door behind him. But once he was alone, the mask slipped. He paced the room, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had a kid like Jamal gotten so close to the truth? He had been careful, meticulous even, but now everything was at risk. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "We have a problem," he said when the line connected, his voice low and urgent. "The kid knows too much. We need to handle this now." The person on the other end of the line said something, and the judge's jaw tightened. "I don't care how you do it," he snapped. "Just make sure it's clean." He hung up, his hands trembling slightly as he set the phone down. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about survival. Back in the holding room, Jamal sat on a hard plastic chair, his mind racing. He knew he had stirred up a hornet's nest, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. He had to keep pushing, keep digging. The problem was, he didn't know who to trust. The system was rigged, and the people who were supposed to protect him were the same ones who had put him in this position. He thought about his mother, about the fear in her eyes when she begged him to let it go. He thought about Marcus, about the life that had been stolen from him. And he thought about the judge, about the cold, calculating look in his eyes. Jamal knew he was playing with fire, but he also knew he didn't have a choice. If he didn't fight, who would? As the hours passed, the tension in the courthouse grew. Reporters camped outside, their cameras trained on the doors, waiting for someone, anyone, to come out and give them answers. Inside, lawyers huddled in corners, whispering furiously as they tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for being tough but fair, was particularly uneasy. She had worked with the judge for years, and she had always respected him. But now, doubts were creeping in. She had seen the look on Jamal's face, the conviction in his voice. What if he was telling the truth? What if the man she had trusted for so long wasn't who she thought he was? She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. And if it was true, what did that mean for her? For the cases she had prosecuted under his watch? The questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't have time to dwell on them. She had a job to do, and right now, that job was damage control. Meanwhile, Jamal's story was starting to spread. Social media lit up with hashtags and speculation, and news outlets scrambled to piece together the details. Who was this kid? What did he know? And why was he accusing a judge of murder? The public was hungry for answers, and the pressure was mounting. For the first time, the people in power were feeling the heat, and they didn't like it. Calls were made, favors were called in, and plans were set in motion. The system was closing ranks, and Jamal was about to find out just how far they would go to protect their own. As night fell, Jamal was released on bail, his mother waiting for him outside the courthouse. She hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I told you to stay out of trouble," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why couldn't you just listen?" Jamal didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain to her that this wasn't about trouble, it was about justice. About doing what was right, even when it felt impossible. He knew the road ahead would be hard, maybe even dangerous, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. He had started something, and he had to see it through. But as they drove home, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the dark streets. Was that car following them? Or was it just his imagination? He didn't know, but he couldn't take any chances. When they got home, he made sure all the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn. His mother watched him, her face pale with worry, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They both knew the stakes. That night, Jamal lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about the judge, about the men he had seen that night at the warehouse. He thought about Marcus, about the life that had been cut short. And he thought about himself, about the choices he had made and the ones he still had to make. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to back down, no matter what. But as he drifted off to sleep, a noise outside his window jolted him awake. He sat up, his heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Was it just an animal? Or was it something, or someone else? He didn't know, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He reached for the baseball, but he kept by his bed, his grip tightening as he crept toward the window. The noise grew louder, closer. And then, just as he was about to pull back the curtain, a shadow moved outside. Jamal froze, his heart racing. Whoever was out there, they weren't leaving. And that could only mean one thing. The fight was far from over.